5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
You're listening to Relentless. This is the show for high performers who are driven and committed to being at their best. Nick Peterson and Jonathan Montgomery, co-founders of Relentless Dietetics, are your hosts.
Welcome to the Relentless Podcast. I'm Nick Peterson, hanging out today with Jonathan Montgomery.
What is up?
And the Dr. Trevor Cashy.
Hello!
And as per usual today, we're going to discuss a little bit better every day. And I do want to point out that a lot of our reviews on the podcast this week were telling us how much they love that your guys' intro is exactly the same every time.
What? We're doing the same thing every time?
Yeah.
T, did you know this?
Hello!
Yeah. I actually just have a soundboard of Trevor, so it's everything he says is a combination of buttons I have.
Man, that would be fantastic. I wish I had a soundboard of Trevor when I was doing my emails. I could just kind of hit a button and pop him in.
I have a whole folder just filled with pictures so that, like the 1,000-word picture, whatever you want to call it thing. So that takes care of that. I just have like pictures of myself making funny faces, and then I'll just send that picture out as an email and don't need any more information.
I totally took that from you, and I have all kinds of ones of me with double thumbs up and a discouraging look or an encouraging look, depending on what I type over top of it. It is muy effective.
Yeah, I like to confuse people and say something discouraging, but give them an encouraging look.
Yes.
Sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll be like, Trevor, I have an emergency. And I'll wait like 20 minutes, and then I get like a picture of his foot or a sock or something. So
You got the foot.
Yeah. So I promise today we're here to talk about useful stuff. We talk a lot about advanced concepts and mental models. Really help explain and codify how we make decisions. And one of the mental models or concepts that Trevor, that you introduced to me that had a huge impact on our life and the way we run our program is the idea of relative change.
Oh my goodness. This is something that I learned about that kind of snuck up on me. It wasn't like a eureka moment as much as I just started operating this way without really realizing it. Because I was like born a scientist, I guess is probably the best way to say it. And always making comparisons of one thing to another to try and make sense of information I got, getting expelled from a system, whatever that system may be, a video game, sludge on the ground, whatever the case may have been. And it wasn't until, I was, I don't know, a couple of months into my work formally in a laboratory when I realized that one of the machines that I was using didn't actually give me units. Like it gave a number and it gave a percent, but it wasn't like dollars or pounds or, inches or whatever the case may have been. It just an AU on the side of one of the axes. And then I asked my PI, which stands for principal investigator, which is a fancy word for boss, what that meant. And he said it's arbitrary units. And I went, what the shit does that mean? Well, it turns out that it means just that. Is that when you run an experiment, especially in terms of spectroscopy, which is just a fancy word of shooting light into stuff and getting numbers back, that you have to tell the machine what zero is. And when you tell the machine what zero is, and then you take your next measurement, it gives you a number relative to what you tell the machine zero is. And I had been applying this concept my entire life without really realizing it from a formal aspect. But when I started thinking about it in terms of nutrition and biochemistry and medicine and all this other stuff, that when you start to work with people, I realized that I decided I was going to have wherever they currently were as their 0 point. Not where they used to be, not where they think they're going, where they currently are, that is what is 0. All right? Are you a nurse and already take 20,000 steps a day? That's 0, right? Are you eating 1,000 calories one day, 3,000 calories the next, and 2,000 calories the next day? That is your 0, right? And in the context of applying that to how RD operates, the goal is not to flip your life upside down at all. right? That is not the point. There are plenty of programs where here's a piece of paper, take your whole house, dump it over a trash can and start over. Definitely not how I would want to operate under those circumstances. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's reasonable. I think there's a shock and awe factor, but I don't think the longevity is there. In any case, the goal is to take your current life and create a baseline from it. So here is how I operate normally. And then over time, you can make subtle changes that graduate you into a new lifestyle without having to do anything drastic. So that's all. I'm going to leave it there because I'm kind of out of breath, but I hope that makes sense to kind of getting this started off.
Outside of you needing to catch your breath, I think really that kind of philosophy is basically just the key concept behind everything we are about. It's behind better every day. It's not better all at once or better overnight, and that's for a really good reason. Small, incremental, sustainable change from baseline, it kind of adds up to massive differences. But a couple things, allow this to make the most impact. And Trevor, you really touched on a big one for me, and that is to kind of always consider that you're comparing change to the baseline. Not always moving that goalpost so the change seems to appear inconsequential or, on the other hand, more meaningful than it is, but taking that 0 point, setting it in stone, drawing that line in the sand, and using that as your baseline for all change moving from here on out, whether it's a new program, a new process, or a new endeavor. You got to have that ground zero. But another thing I think that's key is kind of always looking to exert your efforts towards the tasks that are going to provide you the most positive benefit, the largest return or the highest leverage overall, again, in relation to that baseline, while sustaining the changes you've already put in place. And often this is going to be found by focusing on that relative change and not just an absolute change, going from a 0 to a 1 versus a 9 to a 10, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for you that might want to rush to Google and look up relative change, I just want to clarify, we are not talking about Einstein's theory of relativity, which encompasses special relativity, general relativity. I just want to make that clear because I think that's a source of confusion when we talk about relative change and people run home and ask the Google.
Yeah,
yes, this is simply the comparison of one value to another. And the one value that you associate with 0 is the one that is important to you. And that 0 does change over time under certain circumstances, which we may or may not discuss later. But it is what is currently happening now compared to what was happening before. Is there a difference? What is that difference? And do I like that difference? And then that is what is used to guide decisions.
Yeah, speaking of Einstein, I can absolutely recall staring at a clock and wanting the day to end, thus kind of subsequently traveling time. But I never was actually able to generate a legitimate explanation of that. I'm clearly no Einstein, but maybe the smartest guy I know, Dr. K could break that down one day. But I think that's a totally different episode when it comes to relative change like we're talking about here.
Man, I took a class on that and decided that I liked germs better.
I'm right there with you.
That's fair. So for the sake of, again, not going down that rabbit hole of relativity, the practical application, I think, just to touch on one more time, is if you already take 20,000 steps, like Trevor said, that's your 0, and all the changes are made from that point, right? So the absolute change is just the difference over 2 periods of time from where you were at to where you're at now, and then from where you're at now to where you're going.
Yeah. So, in this case, going from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 5 to 6, or from 100 down to 99, those are all absolute changes of 1. You're adding or taking away a single unit, whether that's inches, widgets, arbitrary units, or whatever it is, the absolute value is 1.
Right. And like Trevor, you mentioned your arbitrary units. The relative change is different than the absolute, simply because it expresses a change as a percentage of the value, right? So it's going to determine how it affects the system or the person or whatever more so potentially than the absolute change.
Yeah, it adds weight. The number itself may be the same, whether or not you express it as a percentage, but the weight that number does change, and that is easily expressed as a percentage. So traveling 1 mile is not that big of a deal if you're going to travel 28 miles for a marathon. But, because that is 1/28th, right? But if you are going to travel 2 miles, then going 1 mile is 1/2 of your total distance. So in each of these situations, the unit is still the same, but on a relative scale, the 1 mile holds greater weight at a shorter distance.
Just so nobody gets offended, Dr. Kashi clearly meant 26.2 miles in a marathon, and that 1 mile was 126.2's percentages, or whatever that figure is. But like you guys just said, you nailed it. The difference between 1 and 2 and 199 are the same unit, but worlds apart in terms of their overall impact and change when looking at how that difference affects the whole, rather than just looking at the absolute value. 1 does not always equal 1 in this context, and that's that concept of weight that T just alluded to.
And weight is definitely also a good word to use in context of how much a person weighs, because one person might get mad that they only lost 1 pound, right? Or 2 pounds or whatever. And when you think of it in terms of an absolute value, maybe that's a lot, maybe that isn't. But from a relative change where maybe you gained 10 pounds over the last year, losing a pound is a massive difference on a relative scale. So you might be mad that the whole value or the absolute value isn't what you want it to be, but relative to a point where it was, the actual weight of that weight is much different.
If you're ready to get the body you desire without depriving yourself of the foods you enjoy, download your free diet playbook now at www.relentlesspodcast.com.
And I think another practical real world application for a lot of our listeners is going to be in the context of, for example, a complex system like a company. If you add 10 people to a company, is that going to cause problems? And if you add 10 people to a company of 10, probably that's 100% relative change. It's a massive, massive change. You doubled the number of people. If you add 10 people to a company of 100, it's probably not going to affect the systems that much. And that's kind of the concept again of the weight, right? Jonathan, do you want to touch on your just the overall concept of the rules of threes and tripling?
Yeah, it kind of like that other rule of thirds we talked about previously. Somehow, somewhere, I came across this rule. I didn't make it up. Someone much smarter than me came up with this. But it's just this concept of threes and tens for your business. And basically, the rule just states that every single thing in your business is pretty much going to break when you either triple in size or hit the next multiple of 10. So go from 1 to 3, 3 to 10, 10 to 30, 30 to 100. You guys get the idea. What worked when you had one employee, you started out, it's not going to work when you add a couple of partners. Who decides what to do next? Who's using the credit card or taking money from the account or scheduling tasks? That is all very easy to come up with when it's just you, but not so much when there are others involved. Adding a fourth person may not break things, but triple your way from 3 to 10, and now payroll might need to get tweaked. How you communicate, schedule meetings, break up responsibility, handle your span of control. It all has to change. Take that same absolute number, 3 to 10, a 7, add another 7 people. It's the same absolute number, not a big deal. Even the relative change of a double, not a big deal. But hit that triple again, go to 30, or from 30 to 100, and suddenly you're going to find holes that you didn't even think to explore for and didn't know existed. And we've seen this in our own company as we've grown and scaled, and it just really illustrates well the difference between relative change and the absolute. Right now, for us, for instance, 100 new employees tomorrow would completely crush our systems. So if you have a company at the level of 30 and you add 100 people, guess what? You're in trouble. But at 1,000 employees or 10,000 employees, it wouldn't even necessarily cause a ripple. And that's just a really kind of good, concrete example of relative change versus absolute numbers and how it can really wreak havoc on a complicated system.
Jonathan and I both have all the skills necessary to do nutrition for people at a high level, but we don't do our own because the whole, hire a coach thing, which we have an episode on. But Trevor, how much have you seen my weight fluctuate from day to day?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I was going to say upwards of like 7%, I would say. So, in a 15-pound range, depending on what the heck is going on, up or down.
So the important thing here is that it's 7%, right? So a 7% on a 100-pound girl would not be 15 pounds. And I think that's kind of, Jonathan sees this all the time in the data. It's a 15-pound swing on a 100-pound girl would probably be pretty alarming, right?
Yeah, practically speaking, if we take a look at just some numbers here, a 350-pound individual, a swing plus minus, even from a trough to a height of 7 pounds, a day is common. So that could be a 7-pound shortage and then a 14-pound spike from that baseline. Not a big deal. Something they're used to, something they can expect regularly. That same thing on a 120-pound individual is going to look, feel, and mean something totally different. And it may indeed be a cause for alarm. Slap 7 pounds overnight on somebody in that 100-pound range, and they are not going to be happy. They're going to notice it and feel it. Somebody, our size, Nick, Trevor, we may not notice it. And this is why, we always encourage our people to be aware of this concept of relative change when it comes to looking at the scale, both in terms of the day-to-day fluctuations, but also in relation to their baseline. As Trevor alluded to, if every year at this time of year you put on 10 pounds, and this time you only lost 11 pounds, or you only lost a single pound, 1 pound, that's an actual change of 11 pounds from where you would have been had you not been. So that's a good relative example too.
Yeah, I think another thing that, because we've all been in fitness long enough, is exercise, right? Because people get confused about the effect of adding an extra day of exercise. So if you're working out 1 day a week and you add a second day, you've effectively doubled the amount of exercise. The absolute change is 1 day. It's really, really easy to think adding another day is going to be the same as when you added the second day. But it's probably not, because you're only adding, the relative change is smaller, right? When you go from 2 to 3 days a week, that's what, a 50% increase instead of 100? And as you add days, the weight that we've been talking about becomes less and less. It's actually less and less effective as you add days because the relative change is smaller.
Yeah, there comes a point in most things, but especially where training is concerned, when less is actually going to be more for you. And focusing on the quality of the session becomes far more important than the quantity. And this tends to fall in line when the relative change begins to significantly decline.
And that decline is just the point of diminished returns, which is something that is really important to identify, right? Because maybe adding a 7th day of training is not really going to have an impact going from 6 to 7. It certainly won't have the same impact as when you went from 0 to 1.
Yeah, I think honestly, one of the highest leverage activities you can engage in, and one of the biggest ways to make a positive impact on your day-to-day life, when you're looking for more ways to spend your time to get better every day, is actively searching for ways to increase the amount of relative change in your life. This may not, like you said, be another day of training, but it may be in some other more neglected area, as opposed to simply stacking up these incremental or absolute units to these areas you may be approaching a cap in, nearing diminished returns, or offering smaller relative change. With training, again, it's something in our wheelhouse and we hear it a lot, but maybe rather than adding that extra day of exercise, taking you from 6 to 7 or sliding in a 2 a day, how about like a day of reading or a meditation or playing with your damn kids or taking a nap? Maybe something that you can go from that elusive 0 to 1, that infinite relative change, can have a far more pronounced effect for you than just simply trying to collect, pieces of the puzzle. Like, 7 days, what's that doing for you?
I think if you look at yourself, or you look at the whole, whether it be fitness or business or just success in general from a more holistic point of view, it may very well be that you're the weakest link. There's low-hanging fruit, as Trevor would say. There's low-hanging fruit that would have a much, much bigger impact than just kind of banging your head against the wall, adding these other things that you already do a lot of.
I totally agree. I think one of the things that are most difficult to measure in terms of relative change are things that you can't really measure at all. Just like Jonathan brought back, you normally would have gained 10 pounds, but this year you only lost 1, and therefore the relative change is 11, which is pretty damn good. A lot of the things you can do to impact relative change are the things that don't necessarily have things you can measure as the benefit. Because if you cannot measure something that has not happened, So if you're putting energy into things that decrease the chances of a negative result, then you cannot explicitly measure the lack of a negative, right? So it may seem like nothing is happening, but in reality, you've prevented all of this bad crap from happening, putting you light years ahead than you otherwise would have been. And not gaining weight, for example, in a time where you would have normally gained is a relative change that is massive, but not inherently measurable.
And, just to circle back kind of where, we talk about low hanging fruit, as Nick pointed out, and being the weakest link. I think a lot of this desire coming to chip away what you're already working on, or continue kind of like adding fuel to the fire, going from that 6 to 7 days of training, is because in theory, it's really great to draw out a 100% effective program. It's really easy to go, well, if I train these 7 days a week, hit these groups, do these movements, I've got a 100% effective program, and it sounds like a great idea. But what you might be missing is if you're only able to apply 70% effort to that execution, while now subsequently only putting 50% into your sleep and recovery, and that's all you're able to put out, there's no wonder why you're not getting the results. You may indeed be the weakest link here. It may make a lot more sense and overall impact for you to drop that program down, where maybe on paper it's a 3 to 4 day routine that only seems to be about 80% effective, but it's one that you can hit at 90 to 100%. It's going to be a lot easier to make that progress when your effort and your involvement is not the limiting factor and you are not that weakest link. It's going to be a lot easier to tweak the program when you're firing on all cylinders. And I think that's one of the key things I'm trying to get across here and we're talking about is look for those areas where you can have that massive relative improvement, because that's probably an area where you have a big gap. That filling that in is going to fill in some of those intangibles, as Dr. Cashy just pointed out, Trevor, where you're talking about, you may not be able to measure it right away, but the impact is probably going to manifest itself in some areas you are currently measuring.
Yeah. And I guess to bring it to something more practical, getting an extra 45 minutes of sleep may keep you from getting the flu, which may set you back for a month or longer, depending on the sort of crap you have to go through to get better from it, right? And you can't measure not getting the flu, right? You can only measure the negative impact getting the flu causes you. So these are the types of things that I'm talking about specifically, like things that maybe may not be totally apparent, the benefit now, but you definitely see the damage later. And as Jonathan said, maybe training 7 days a week looks perfect on paper, but I guess the paradigm in terms of relative change, one, it does have limits in the context of biology, because let's say, for instance, you only have the capacity to burn 1,000 calories a week for exercise before your body starts to downregulate itself. Meaning, like this has been described as like constrained energy expenditure, right? So basically, in the context of training, this means the more training you add past a certain point, you just start sandbagging all the other days, right? So if you burn the maximum amount of calories you can, if you're thinking in terms of calorie burn or maximum effort or rate of perceived exertion, whatever method you want to use, if you can do that over a 4-day period, then by adding a 5, 6, or 7 day is only taking away the amount of effort you're putting into the other days. And if you have properly programmed training, like Jonathan and us and we are a huge fan of, then you can see that happening when you measure what's going on. But what happens is a lot of people take the relative change component, like saying, okay, from 6 to 7, that's like a 17% increase. That is a diminished return, but it's still a return, and not a small one. But when you don't take into account the other factors associated with, I guess, things like energy expenditure, you may not realize that by adding the extra day, you're just taking it easy on all the other days to give yourself energy to do that 7th day. It does have limits in one direction or the other. So this is a good paradigm to think in. And then you have to incorporate real life stuff like measurements to make sure that the things that you are incorporating do make sense for you.
Bringing it back to like what the practical application, what Jonathan was just saying about, hey, maybe you should take a nap, right? Jonathan hired somebody smarter than all of us. You did that HRV and kind of monitor your heart rate and stuff. And I'm pretty sure there were points where the data said, hey, man, you'll actually get better results if you take the day off and take a nap or read a book and get a dog.
Absolutely. And it was actually like, listening to someone who put that into that context and seeing those numbers that said, oh, I'm tired. Maybe I should listen to that. But, of course, we're not going to listen to ourselves, because one, we don't trust ourselves to be objective. And two, there's no such thing as taking a day off, right? You got to grind. So as Trevor pointed out, this feedback, this information, it will let you know, hey, you've already reached your peak. Go ahead and spend a day recovery. That way you can put more effort into your actual training. And, that's priceless information. However you want to get it, however you want to intuit it, or however you want to interpret it, sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to training. And, focusing on those 0 to 1s. I wasn't taking any naps. I wasn't focusing on recovery. So that was an area where relatively just adding 1 in was a huge change.
Yeah. Yep. And I think we'll just delve into that in the next episode because we're running out of time here. It's just the reliability, predictability, or the success of an entire system, right? Because it's your stress, your sleep, your food, your exercise. It's all just kind of bleeding together. So where do you identify the zeros and turn them into ones? And the output's going to be much, much greater. So we'll hit that next time and kind of talk about what all that means and identifying that low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely. I think that's all we got today. So thanks for listening. And when it comes to relative change, we could have spent a whole lot of time thinking of a witty outro here. But instead, we just decided to focus that effort in other areas we've been lacking in lately. And for me, that's a nap. So I'm going to go snag one. Have a good one.
You've been listening to the Relentless Podcast. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to keep getting a little bit better every day, do us a favor, head over to iTunes, subscribe, leave us an honest review, and be sure not to miss the next one.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.